Umamusume. They were born to run. They inherit the names of horses from another world, whose histories were sometimes tragic and sometimes wonderful. And with that, they run. That is certainly one of the ways to lore dump at the beginning of a series. Enough horsing around. Everyone knows that lore dumping, whether through pointlessly long exposition or oversaturated character monologues, is generally an audience's least favorite method of world building. How then, despite all that, does Umamusume's world building manage to be surprisingly put together? Welcome to English class, in which I jump on the bandwagon of horse addiction to spin my own oversaturated monologue about the basics of world building. Class, please open your textbooks to Season 1 of Umamusume, Pretty Derby, and today we'll be talking about a world that is familiar, yet strange. While stories can attract an audience for a whole host of different traits, one dimension that is often applied is familiarity versus novelty, which doesn't refer to how original a story's idea is, but rather how familiar it is to the audience. Or I could say that, but I'd be lying. I don't see this dimension applied very often, which makes sense, as the divide between fantastical adventure and nostalgic slice of life is quite pronounced. But even despite that divide, almost all stories fall in between those two extremes rather than defaulting to one end or another. The reason for this is simple, but to understand it, we'll have to understand the advantages of leaning towards either side before we can consider the two of them as parts of a whole. Stories that are familiar can invoke a sense of nostalgia in their audience. A good slice of life story could bring you back to your golden years, and a well thought out romance might briefly invoke someone's savory feeling. Might make you glance fondly at your own significant other. The obvious advantages of familiar stories are that they are easy for the audience to understand and connect with, and that the lack of foreign elements removes the need for clunky exposition. The obvious disadvantage is that a story that's too familiar will lack excitement and thus the ability to maintain audience interest. That is to say, an audience is easily bored by a story they know well. On the other end of the spectrum, a story lacking roots in reality can easily bring an audience into a fantastical new world. While a familiar story might invoke nostalgia, a novel story can invoke a yearning for the otherworldly and incite vivid new imaginings. Stories with magical elements and less reliance on the familiar have a limitless scope in which they can explore all kinds of ideas, allowing for a diverse range of novel narratives. The advantages of novelty in literature are about as vast as the possibilities it allows for, and trying to summarize them in a sentence or two is a foolish endeavor. However, the obvious disadvantage is that audience comprehension can help or hinder your efforts to work with the extraordinary. Without a frame of reference, no matter how good the explanations are, reading a completely unfamiliar story can feel like running in the dark. It's even worse when lacking understanding creates unsatisfying stakes and conclusions. With that, it may now be obvious why most stories feature some combination of both. They easily make up for each other's weaknesses. Familiarity serves as a frame of reference when exploring the unknown, and the thrill of discovering something novel easily eliminates ennui. The easiest example to understand is isekai, which combines an unfamiliar world with a familiar point of view. That's one reason why the genre is such a hit. On the other hand, high school romance stories will contain unfamiliar characters set in a familiar environment. Both have their successes and their failures, their strengths and their weaknesses. At this point you might be wondering what any of this has to do with horses, but hold 'em, we're getting there. Umamusume as a whole might feel unfamiliar. Its focus is of course on athletics, which, to be frank, isn't familiar to most people. But beyond that, its superhuman cast may leave common sense in the dust, at 60 kilometers per hour. These, among others, are its unfamiliar elements. Conversely, the fact that it's set in a similar parallel Earth and that it revolves around racing, which is easily understood, gives it a sense of familiarity. However, the act of choosing elements both familiar and foreign is easy. Making those elements mesh with each other is where many stories fall flat. For stories that include elements beyond the boundaries of common sense, what do you think is the most important thing to have? Incredible magic? A relatable protagonist? Thorough explanations? All of these are technically correct. But in order to create a convincing world, first and foremost, you need subtlety. Imagine you were transported to an alternate universe just like your own, except people occasionally ate spiders. Take a moment and try to imagine what this world might be like. Maybe there would be spider recipes? How about a nice big roasted spider on your table, split down the middle like a shrimp, juices everywhere? Sheesh, just the thought makes me nauseous. Don't even get me started on in-universe red spider. While it certainly might be difficult to imagine such a world, without the risk of throwing up, worlds that differ even superficially from our own will have ideas, behaviors, and cultures foreign to us. When I speak of consequences of change, those are what I'm referring to. These ideas, behaviors, and cultures have to be incorporated into the world in such a way that their existence seems natural, not as the consequence of a writing decision. Take infrastructure as an example. In Umamusume, the paintings often shown during the pre-story lore dumps imply the existence of Umas since ancient times. The infrastructure in the world reflects this. There are lanes dedicated to Umas similar to bike lanes in our world, facilities dedicated to serving their various needs, and amenities developed around their unique biology. Contrast this with, and I'm gonna make a bold declaration here, Kaiju number 8. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually really like Kaiju number 8. It's just that it, among other series that feature large amounts of historical and modern property damage, rarely change up the infrastructure in response despite clear precedent to do so. Among other things, Hoshina's backstory implies the existence of kaiju since ancient times, but infrastructure hasn't changed to reflect this. Despite the constant presence of a threat that can emerge from land, air, or sea, there is no visible change to any architecture, and before you say it, shelters should be a given. I don't even mean getting rid of the Tokyo Tower or something. At least lower the building level a bit. Anyhow, that's a little off topic. Point being, a poorly thought out world will just look like the premise was shoehorned into a pre-made shell, while a well thought out world can be convincing enough to make your reader think something is wrong with reality instead. Subtlety in the incorporation of minor details is necessary to ensure the world and story align. But subtlety alone is not enough. If it was, I wouldn't even need to mention Kaiju number 8, which does a decent job of overt world building, even if it's only surface level. Subtle details are only meant to reinforce the pre-established world. When the two act in tandem, they create a synergistic cycle that makes the world significantly more convincing. So, in order to explain what Umamusume does well, I'm going to have to delve into the opposite. Class, please turn to Umamusume Season 2 in your textbooks, and let's take a look at the die-hard fans of horse racing. Where do you draw the line between the subtlety of which I spoke and the overt kind of world building I said Kaiju number 8 does well? Confusing as it may be, where that line is drawn matters, because overt and subtle details can reinforce each other but not themselves. Therefore, where you draw the line will affect how you perceive each cycle. To be honest, when it comes to literature and art, this metaphorical line is just as blurred as everything else. So here I'll propose two methods of drawing that line, and I want you, as the audience of this video, to decide for yourself which one is better. The first is drawing the line where the plot ends. I'll visualize this idea with two circles. This larger one represents the world, and this smaller one represents the plot. The plot fits neatly into the world, and more than one plot can be going on inside said world. These plots may even overlap at times, such as with Umamusume's various seasons and spin-offs. In some cases, the plot can grow over the course of the story to encompass more elements of the world. This method draws a very clear line between what's subtle and what isn't by using a very ugly metric. If it was necessary for the plot, it's not subtle. While it certainly does its job, I don't like it because there are often subtleties worked into the plot. Since the plot can expand, I tend to draw the line at the beginning of the series, and still count elements of the world that do become plot relevant later on as subtle. This method's only redeeming feature is its clarity, but in exchange, it loses the subjectivity that literature is famed for. Using this method, in Umamusume, the horse phone, lane, and clothes are all subtle, while Tracing Academy itself, trainers, and even competitors with their own stories are overt. But you lose the chance to interpret many aspects of the world as subtle, even though they might very well be. The other method is much slower, and there's no easy way to define it, though if I'm being honest, this is how it should be. It's to simply evaluate every single idea through a lens of your choosing. A simple way to decide is if it was told to you, it's overt, and if it was implied, it's subtle. This method allows for more flexibility and nuance when drawing the line. It might end up squiggled, but that's the price we pay. Personally, I prefer the squiggled line, but whichever method you choose is up to you. So how does this come into play? In this case, it's easiest to lead with an example. We're given the existence of Umamusume, superhuman athletes, and their inhuman traits are reinforced by the subtle detail of infrastructure and amenities made to reflect this. Of course, if they simply use normal human facilities, their unique biology would be reduced to something nearly surface level. This in turn is reinforced by the overt detail that Umas and their desire to run have been around since ancient times, as time leads to innovation, investment, and development. Lastly, this is reinforced by the popularity of Uma sports. After all, a sport with a long and storied history is more likely to attract a large following. The fact that Umas are superhuman also reinforces the popularity of Uma sports, as there's considerable interest in inhuman athletics. As such, the cycle is complete. However, this is far from the only cycle you could draw, and could even be perceived as incorrect or invalid depending on where your personal line is. For example, if you draw a line such that popularity and fan counts, which tend to be announced at the beginning of races, are an overt detail, then your cycle will look somewhat different. But all this nonsense about cycles and synergy is worth less than their content. Put simply, this may be a way to visualize something that's already come about, but your focus should be on the elements of the cycle rather than the cycle itself. Despite Umamusume's constant habit of lore dumping, it succeeds because the ideas put into it are not half-baked, not forced, and above all, made with careful consideration of this spiderweb of a world. Ensuring that the right details are in the right places, subtle or not, is the first step to crafting a world that feels beautifully alive. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to see a man about a horse.